The distant rumble of thunder rolled across the dusty plains of Cottonwood Springs, Texas, as Beatrice Finley stood at her kitchen window, staring at the approaching storm with the same quiet resignation she'd worn for years. The year was 1878, and at 32, Beatrice had weathered storms far worse than the one brewing on the horizon. Three small children played in the front room of her modest homestead, children who called her Mama, but who had not come from her womb, a fact the townsfolk never let her forget. "Samuel, Margaret, little James, come help me secure the shutters," she called, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had become her hallmark. 10-year-old Samuel, the oldest, immediately dropped his wooden horse and stood at attention. 8-year-old Margaret followed suit, her corn husk doll forgotten on the floor. 4-year-old James merely looked up with wide eyes before his sister tugged him to his feet. "Is it going to be a big storm, Mama?" Margaret asked, her delicate features pinched with concern. Beatrice smoothed her worn apron and offered a reassuring smile. "Big enough that we need to prepare, darling, but nothing we haven't faced before." Nothing we haven't faced before. The words echoed in her mind as she guided the children through their tasks. How many storms had she weathered since losing her husband Robert to typhoid 3 years earlier? How many sideways glances and whispered comments had she endured in town when she'd taken in these three orphans, her sister's children, after Caroline and her husband were killed in a stagecoach accident? "Look at her playing mother," Beatrice had overheard Mrs. Winthrop say at the general store just last week. The good Lord knew what he was doing when he left her barren. Some women just aren't meant to bear children. The memory stung afresh as she hammered the last shutter into place. Outside, the wind was picking up, sending dust devils swirling across her small vegetable garden, a garden that, like her, refused to surrender despite the harsh conditions. "Mama, someone's coming," Samuel called from the front window, his nose pressed against the glass. Beatrice joined him, squinting at the approaching figure. A lone rider on horseback, battling against the strengthening wind, his dark duster billowing behind him. No one should be out in this weather, and certainly not heading toward their isolated homestead 3 miles from town. "Samuel, take your brother and sister to the back room. Stay there until I call for you." The children obeyed without question. Beatrice reached for Robert's shotgun, which hung above the fireplace. She checked that it was loaded before positioning herself by the door. Strangers weren't always welcome in these parts, especially not strangers who arrived as storms did. The pounding on the door came moments later, nearly drowned out by a thunderclap. "Hello," a deep voice called. "Anyone home? I need shelter from this storm." Beatrice hesitated, her finger hovering near the trigger. "State your business, stranger." "Madam, I've got no business except getting out of this weather. I'm a rancher passing through. Name's Hayes Russell. I've got payment for your trouble." Beatrice took a deep breath and unlatched the door, keeping the shotgun visible but lowered. The man standing on her porch was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the harsh Texas sun. His dark hair was wind-blown, and his eyes, a startling blue, regarded the shotgun with respect, but not fear. "Mrs. he prompted. "Finley. Beatrice Finley." "Mrs. Finley, I apologize for the intrusion. My horse is about done in, and this storm's only getting worse. I can pay for shelter, and I'll be gone at first light." A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Rain began to fall in sheets. "Bring your horse to the lean to beside the barn," Beatrice said, lowering the shotgun completely. "Then come back. No one should be out in this." The man Hayes nodded gratefully and disappeared into the downpour. Beatrice set the shotgun aside and called for the children, who emerged cautiously from the back room. "We have a visitor for the night," she explained. "A Mr. Russell, who's been caught in the storm. I want you all to be polite, but keep to yourselves. Understood?" They nodded solemnly, their eyes wide with curiosity. Strangers were a rarity, especially ones who arrived during storms. When Hayes returned, soaked to the skin despite the short distance, the children stared openly. He removed his hat, revealing more of that dark hair, now plastered to his forehead, and offered them a gentle smile. "Evening," he said, nodding to each child in turn. "Looks like I'll be imposing on your hospitality tonight." "These are my children," Beatrice said, the words flowing naturally despite the lie they contained. "Samuel, Margaret, and James." If Hayes noticed how little the children resembled their supposed mother, with their varying shades of hair and different facial structures, he gave no indication. Instead, he crouched down to their level. "Pleased to meet you all. I've got something in my saddlebag that might interest you if your mother approves." He glanced at Beatrice, who nodded cautiously. From his pocket, Hayes produced 3 peppermint sticks, slightly bent but intact. The children's eyes lit up, but they looked to Beatrice for permission before accepting the treats. "What do you say?" Beatrice prompted. "Thank you, Mr. Russell," they chorused before retreating to a corner of the room to savor their unexpected bounty. "They're well-mannered," Hayes observed, straightening up. "You've done a fine job with them." The simple compliment, delivered without the undercurrent of judgment she'd grown accustomed to, caught Beatrice off guard. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "Are you hungry? I was about to put on supper. I wouldn't want to impose further, but I admit I haven't eaten since morning." "It's no imposition, just simple fare, bean stew, and cornbread." "Sounds like a feast to me, Mrs. Finley." As Beatrice moved about the kitchen, she was acutely aware of Hayes's presence. He'd seated himself at the edge of the room, entertaining the children with tales of his travels while giving her space to work. His voice was deep and measured, his stories appropriate for young ears but engaging enough that even Beatrice found herself listening. Hayes Russell was different from the men in Cottonwood Springs. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged appearance, an ease with the children that spoke of experience. Yet there was something else too, a sadness that occasionally shadowed his eyes, particularly when he looked at little James. The storm raged outside, but inside the small homestead, an unexpected warmth had taken hold. For the first time in years, Beatrice felt the heavy mantle of isolation lift, if only for a night. Supper was a livelier affair than usual. Hayes answered Samuel's endless questions about ranching, complimented Margaret on her careful table manners, and made little James laugh by pretending his spoon was a bucking bronco. Beatrice found herself smiling, really smiling, as she watched this stranger breathe life into her quiet home. "Where are you headed, Mr. Russell?" she asked as she served him a second helping of stew. "North, to the Montana Territory. I've purchased land there, sight unseen, hoping to start fresh." A shadow crossed his face and he quickly redirected. "And you've been in these parts long, Mrs. Finley?" "5 years. My husband and I came from Virginia after the war. He's been gone 3 years now." "I'm sorry for your loss," Hayes said, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you." The conversation shifted to safer topics: the quality of the soil, the challenges of the recent drought, the news from town. Not once did Hayes ask about the children's parentage or comment on their dissimilarity to Beatrice, a courtesy that didn't go unnoticed. After supper, with the children settled in front of the fire with their treasured peppermint sticks, Hayes insisted on helping with the dishes. Standing beside him at the wash basin, Beatrice was acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd stood shoulder to shoulder with a man. Robert had been gone for 3 years, and in that time, she'd grown accustomed to handling everything alone. "I appreciate your hospitality, Mrs. Finley," Hayes said as he dried the last plate. "I'll be out of your hair come morning." "You're welcome to stay until the storm passes fully," Beatrice found herself saying. "The creek might be too swollen to cross safely." Hayes looked at her with those striking blue eyes, a question in their depths. That's mighty kind, but I wouldn't want to intrude longer than necessary. It's no intrusion, she assured him, surprised to find she meant it. Later, after the children were tucked in and Hayes was settled on a bedroll near the fire, Beatrice lay awake in her bed, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. The presence of a stranger under her roof should have left her uneasy. Instead, she felt a curious peace, as if Hayes Russell's arrival had somehow aligned with something she hadn't realized she'd been waiting for. Morning arrived with tentative sunlight breaking through the remaining clouds. The storm had passed, but as Beatrice had predicted, the creek that separated her property from the main road was a roaring torrent. "Looks like I'll be taking you up on that offer to stay a bit longer," Hayes said, returning from his inspection. "If that's still all right?" "Of course," Beatrice replied, ignoring the flutter in her stomach. "The children could use an extra hand with the chores today anyway. The storm's done some damage." And so began an unexpected interlude in the quiet rhythm of Beatrice's life. Hayes proved himself invaluable, repairing the barn roof damaged by wind, reinforcing the chicken coop, and even managing to salvage most of her vegetable garden. The children shadowed him constantly, particularly Samuel, who hung on the rancher's every word about horses and cattle. On the second evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Hayes finally asked the question Beatrice had been dreading. "Those children," he said carefully, "they're not yours by birth, are they?" Beatrice stiffened. "They're mine in all the ways that matter." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "I meant no offense. It's just, there's a story there, I can tell. And I'd like to know it, if you're willing to share." Perhaps it was the gentleness in his voice, or the fact that he'd spent 2 days treating the children with genuine affection, but Beatrice found herself telling him everything. About her sister Caroline's death, about taking in the orphaned children when no one else would, about her own inability to bear children despite years of marriage, and about the town's cruel whispers. "They call me the barren widow behind my back," she concluded, her voice tight with old pain. "They say I'm playing at motherhood, that the good Lord knew what he was doing when he didn't bless me with children of my own." Hayes's expression darkened with each word. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. "People can be cruel without cause," he finally said. "I lost my wife and son to fever 2 years ago. My boy was just 4. Same age as your James." His voice caught. "Some folks back home said it was divine punishment for something or other, as if God works that way, striking down innocents to teach lessons." The revelation stunned Beatrice. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Russell." "Hayes," he corrected gently. "And thank you. But my point is this. I've seen a lot of families in my time, Mrs. Finley. Blood makes relatives, but love makes family. Those children in there? They're yours in every way that counts. And anyone who says different is a fool not worth listening to." Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes. How long had she waited to hear words like these? How many nights had she lain awake, doubting her right to call herself a mother? "Thank you," she whispered. "And please, call me Beatrice." The creek remained impassable for 3 more days, during which time Hayes became an integral part of their small household. He taught Samuel how to properly saddle a horse, showed Margaret how to whittle simple animals from wood, and carried James on his shoulders while they worked in the fields. With each passing day, Beatrice found herself watching him more closely, noticing the way the sun caught his hair, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the gentleness of his large hands when he tended to the children. It was dangerous, these feelings. Hayes was passing through, bound for Montana and a new life there. Beatrice had built her world carefully after Robert's death, centered entirely around the children's well-being. There was no room for foolish romantic notions, yet when the creek finally receded enough for safe crossing, Beatrice felt a hollow ache in her chest. I reckon I should be moving on, Hayes said that evening, his eyes not quite meeting hers. I've imposed on your kindness long enough. You haven't imposed, Beatrice said quickly, perhaps too quickly. You've been a tremendous help. All the same, I have land waiting in Montana, a future to build. The children reacted to the news with dismay. Samuel looked betrayed, Margaret tearful, and little James simply climbed into Hayes's lap, wrapping his small arms around the man's neck as if to prevent his departure. How about this? Hayes said, gently disentangling himself from James. I'll stay one more day, help finish that new chicken coop we started, and we'll have ourselves a proper goodbye. How does that sound? It was a temporary reprieve, nothing more, but Beatrice was grateful for it nonetheless. That night, after the children were asleep, she found Hayes sitting on the porch steps, staring up at the stars. May I join you? She asked. He nodded, moving over to make space. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the Texas plains surrounding them. Will you be all right out here alone, Beatrice? Hayes finally asked. These children need a father figure, especially young Samuel. He's at that age. We've managed for 3 years, she said, though there was no conviction in her voice. Managing isn't the same as thriving, Hayes observed quietly. The statement hung between them, pregnant with unspoken possibilities. Beatrice felt her heart hammering in her chest. Was he suggesting? No, surely not. I should head to bed, she said abruptly, standing. Tomorrow will be a busy day. Hayes rose as well. Beatrice, He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Sleep well. That night, Beatrice dreamed of Montana, a place she'd never seen but imagined as vast green pastures beneath towering mountains. In her dream, the children ran freely, their laughter carried on a cool breeze, and Hayes stood beside her, his hand warm in hers. She woke with tears on her cheeks. The final day of Hayes's stay dawned clear and warm. True to his word, he spent the morning completing the chicken coop, with Samuel proudly working alongside him. Beatrice prepared a special meal for their last supper together, a roast chicken, preserved from the winter stores, with fresh vegetables from the garden. As the sun began its descent, Hayes excused himself to tend to his horse, preparing for his departure at first light. Beatrice sent the children to gather eggs, needing a moment alone to compose herself. She had no right to feel this loss. Hayes Russell had been a temporary guest, nothing more. That her heart had foolishly attached itself to him in such a short time was her burden alone. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear him return until he spoke. Beatrice. She turned, startled, to find Hayes standing in the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically nervous. I've been doing some thinking, he continued, taking a step toward her. About Montana. About the future. Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. Oh? I purchased 500 acres sight unseen. Good grazing land according to the land agent. Room for 100 head of cattle to start, with the potential for more. A small house that needs work but has good bones. He took another step closer. It's a lot of land for one man. I'm sure you'll manage, Beatrice said carefully, though her pulse was racing now. Thing is, I don't want to just manage. Like I told you yesterday, managing isn't thriving. Hayes was standing directly in front of her now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes. I've been alone for 2 years now. Thought that was my lot in life, after losing Sarah and my boy. But then this storm blew me to your doorstep, and I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Beatrice couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only stand there as Hayes took her hands in his. I know this is sudden. Probably seems crazy, but I've learned the hard way that life is short, and opportunities shouldn't be wasted. His grip tightened slightly. Come with me to Montana, Beatrice. You and the children. We could build something there. A family, a home, a future. Hayes, I. Beatrice's voice caught. We barely know each other. I know you're strong enough to raise 3 children on your own in this unforgiving country. I know you've got more love in your heart than most people have in their entire being. I know those children adore you, and rightly so. His voice softened. And I know that when I ride out of here tomorrow, I'll be leaving a piece of my heart behind unless you come with me. Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes. The children already love you like their own father. Samuel asked me this morning if I could teach him to rope cattle. Margaret wants to know if there are wildflowers in Montana. And James? Hayes smiled. James asked if he could call me Papa. The tears spilled over then, rolling down Beatrice's cheeks unchecked. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. That's all I'm asking for now. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. Hayes released her hands and stepped back, giving her space. I'll check on the children, he said. Take all the time you need. Alone in the kitchen, Beatrice pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Was this madness? To consider uprooting her life, the children's lives, for a man she'd known less than a week? Yet something deeper than reason was pulling at her, a recognition that went beyond time or logic. Through the window, she could see Hayes with the children by the chicken coop. Samuel was talking animatedly, gesturing with his hands. Margaret was showing Hayes something she'd found, probably one of her precious rocks. James was perched on Hayes's shoulders, his small hands resting on the man's head, his face alight with happiness. They looked like a family. They felt like a family. Supper that night was a subdued affair. Hayes didn't mention his proposal again, and Beatrice avoided his gaze as much as possible, still wrestling with her decision. The children sensed the tension, but didn't understand its source. Will you visit us when you're settled in Montana? Samuel asked Hayes as Beatrice cleared the plates. Hayes glanced at Beatrice before answering carefully. I hope our paths will cross again, one way or another. I wish you could stay forever, Margaret said, her lower lip trembling slightly. Me too, little one, Hayes replied softly. After the children were in bed, Beatrice found Hayes on the porch again, just as she had the night before. This time she didn't ask permission to join him, but simply sat beside him on the steps. I've been thinking about your offer, she began. And? His voice was carefully neutral. It's crazy, she said. Completely irrational. Hayes nodded, his expression falling. I understand. No, you don't, Beatrice continued, because despite how irrational it is, I want to say yes. Hayes's head snapped up, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. You do? I do. But I'm afraid, Hayes. Afraid of building hopes on a foundation that might not hold. Afraid of uprooting the children for something uncertain. Life's uncertain no matter what, Beatrice. Hayes took her hand, his touch warm and steadying. I can promise you this much. I will work every day to build a good life for you and those children. I will respect you as my equal partner. I will love them as my own. And me? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Hayes's gaze softened. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you opened your door with that shotgun in your hands. It's fast, I know, but I've never been more certain of anything. The words unleashed something in Beatrice's chest, a flood of emotion she'd kept carefully dammed for years. I'll come with you, she whispered. We'll come with you. Hayes's smile was like sunrise breaking across his face. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Beatrice responded, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. When they finally broke apart, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. Thank you for taking this leap of faith with me. Thank you for seeing us as a blessing, not a burden, she replied. The next morning, Beatrice gathered the children to share their decision. Their reactions ranged from shock to elation, with Samuel immediately peppering them with practical questions about the journey, Margaret wondering if she could bring her collection of special rocks, and James simply climbing from Hayes's lap to Beatrice's and back again, as if physically connecting his new family. "When will we leave?" Samuel asked, his eyes shining with excitement. "We need time to prepare," Beatrice explained. "Sell what we can't take, pack what we can. Hayes will continue to Montana to start getting the house ready, and we'll follow in a month's time." "That's so long," Margaret protested. "It'll fly by," Hayes assured her. "And I'll send letters every week telling you about your new home." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. News of their plans spread through Cottonwood Springs like wildfire. The reactions were mixed, genuine well wishes from a few, barely concealed judgment from others. Beatrice overheard Mrs. Winthrop in the general store, her sharp voice carrying clearly. "Barely knew him a week before deciding to follow him across the country. And with those children in tow. Just goes to show what I've always said about Beatrice Finley." Beatrice's cheeks burned with humiliation, but before she could retreat, another voice joined the conversation: Mr. Thompson, the elderly store owner who rarely involved himself in town gossip. "What you've always said, Mrs. Winthrop, has rarely been worth listening to." His voice was calm but firm. "Mrs. Finley has raised those children with more love and dignity than most, despite losing her husband and having no support from so-called Christian neighbors. If she's found happiness with Mr. Russell, I say good for her." Mrs. Winthrop sputtered indignantly, but Mr. Thompson wasn't finished. "And I might add, calling a woman who's taken in 3 orphans Barren shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what motherhood truly means." Beatrice slipped away before Mrs. Puckett Winthrop could recover, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Mr. Thompson's defense, unexpected as it was, felt like vindication after years of silent judgment. The day of Hayes's departure arrived too quickly. He promised to be back within 2 months if Beatrice and the children couldn't make the journey on their own, but they all knew it was better for him to establish their new home first. Still, saying goodbye was harder than any of them had anticipated. "I'll write as soon as I arrive," Hayes promised, holding Beatrice close, "and I'll be counting the days until you join me." "We all will," she assured him, fighting back tears. The children's goodbyes were equally emotional, with Samuel trying to maintain a stoic facade that crumbled when Hayes presented him with his own pocket knife. "To practice whittling until we meet again." Margaret sobbed openly into Hayes's shirt until he promised her that Montana had the most beautiful wildflowers she'd ever seen. Little James was perhaps the hardest, clinging to Hayes's neck and having to be gently pried away by Beatrice. "Papa come back?" James asked tearfully. "Very soon, little man," Hayes assured him, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "And then, we'll never be apart again." As Hayes mounted his horse and rode away, Beatrice stood with the children watching until he disappeared from sight, a strange mixture of sadness and hope filling her heart. True to his word, Hayes wrote faithfully. His letters arrived every 2 weeks, full of descriptions of their new home, the progress he was making on repairs, and his encounters with neighbors who were curious but friendly. He described the mountains that rose in the distance, the clear streams full of fish, and the vast grasslands perfect for cattle. Each letter ended the same way: "With all my love, counting the days until we're together again." Beatrice read each letter aloud to the children multiple times, until even James could recite parts of them from memory. In between letters, they prepared for their journey, selling the homestead to a young couple just arrived from Pennsylvania, carefully packing treasured possessions and saying goodbye to the few genuine friends they'd made in Cottonwood Springs. The night before their departure, Beatrice sat alone on the porch steps where she and Hayes had sealed their future together. The homestead looked different now, half empty. No longer truly theirs, yet she felt no regret, only a growing anticipation for what lay ahead. A sound behind her made her turn. Samuel stood in the doorway, looking older somehow in the fading light. "May I join you, Mama?" he asked. "Of course, darling." He sat beside her, his lanky frame still boyish, but hinting at the man he would become. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the Texas sky. "Are you scared?" Samuel finally asked. "About going so far away?" Beatrice considered the question carefully. "A little," she admitted. "It's always frightening to step into the unknown, but I'm more excited than scared." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Me too." He hesitated, then added, "I think Pa would have liked Hayes." The statement caught Beatrice off guard. Samuel rarely spoke of his father, who had died when he was just 7. "Why do you say that?" "Pa always said the measure of a man is how he treats those who can't do anything for him in return. Hayes treats James and Margaret real good, even though they're just little. And he treats you like—" Samuel searched for the right words. "Like you're special. Important." Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes. "That's very wise, Samuel. And yes, I think your father would have approved of Hayes." Samuel leaned against her shoulder, a rare display of affection from a boy trying so hard to be grown. "I'm glad we're going with him, Mama. I think we're going to be happy there." "I think so too, my love." The journey to Montana Territory was long and arduous, taking them nearly 3 weeks by train and stagecoach. The children, initially excited by the adventure, grew weary of travel by the final days. Even Beatrice found her patience tested by the endless hours of motion, cramped quarters, and strange beds. But all fatigue vanished the moment their final stagecoach crested a hill and Hayes came into view, standing beside a wagon at the small trading post where he'd arranged to meet them. He looked different somehow, more solid, more rooted, his skin tanned dark from weeks of outdoor work. When he spotted them, his entire face transformed with joy. The stagecoach had barely stopped before the children were tumbling out, racing toward Hayes with cries of excitement. He dropped to one knee, gathering all 3 into his arms at once, his laughter mingling with theirs in the clear mountain air. Beatrice descended more slowly, suddenly shy in the face of their reunion. 6 weeks had passed since they'd seen each other. What if things had changed? What if the connection they'd felt had been nothing more than a fleeting spark, already faded? Then Hayes looked up, his eyes finding hers over the children's heads, and all doubt vanished. He gently disentangled himself from the children and walked toward her, his gaze never leaving her face. "Welcome home, Beatrice," he said softly, before drawing her into his arms. The kiss they shared was brief, but full of promise, mindful of the children's presence and the public setting. When they parted, Hayes kept his arm around her waist, turning to include the children in their circle. "Our home is about an hour's ride from here," he explained. "I've got the wagon loaded with supplies, and I thought we might have a picnic lunch halfway there, by the creek." "Is our house big?" Margaret wanted to know. "It's not grand," Hayes admitted, "but it's solid, with 3 bedrooms and a good kitchen. And the view." He smiled. "Well, you'll see for yourselves soon enough." The hour's journey passed quickly, with Hayes pointing out landmarks and the children excitedly spotting wildlife deer grazing in distant meadows, a fox slipping into underbrush, and even a bald eagle soaring overhead, which Hayes declared was a good omen for their new beginning. Beatrice sat beside him on the wagon seat, acutely aware of his presence. The warmth of his thigh pressed against hers, the strength in his hands as he handled the reins, the occasional glances he sent her way, full of quiet happiness. "Nervous?" he asked softly, when the children were distracted by a prairie dog colony. "A little," she admitted. "It's all so new." Hayes nodded understandingly. "For me too. But we'll figure it out together." When they finally turned onto a long dirt track that Hayes announced was their driveway, Beatrice felt a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. The track wound through a stand of pines before opening onto a clearing where a house stood not large, as Hayes had warned, but sturdy-looking, with fresh whitewash gleaming in the afternoon sun. Behind it sprawled meadows dotted with wildflowers, and beyond those, the distant silhouette of mountains against the vast Montana sky. "There it is," Hayes said, a note of pride in his voice. "Our home." The children were silent for once, taking in the scene with wide eyes. Then Margaret spotted the wildflowers and let out a squeal of delight. "You were right! They're everywhere!" Hayes laughed. "I told you, didn't I? And wait until you see inside. I've got some surprises for each of you." The surprises turned out to be bedrooms prepared with special touches for each child, a handcrafted wooden sword and shield hanging on the wall for Samuel, a display shelf for Margaret's rock collection, and a rocking horse for James that Hayes had traded with a neighbor to acquire. Beatrice's surprise came last. Hayes led her to the master bedroom, where a beautiful quilt in shades of blue and green covered the bed. "My neighbor's wife made it as a wedding gift," Hayes explained, suddenly looking uncertain. "I told her we weren't exactly married yet, but she insisted. Said every new bride needs a proper quilt." He hesitated. "I hope that wasn't presumptuous of me. I thought perhaps, once you're settled, we might make things official. There's a preacher who comes through every other Sunday." Beatrice touched the quilt reverently, then turned to Hayes with shining eyes. "It's beautiful. And yes, I'd like that very much." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony attended by their nearest neighbors, the Johnsons, who'd provided the quilt, and the Millers, whose 3 children had already become playmates for Samuel, Margaret, and James. The preacher was a kind elderly man who, when Hayes explained their unusual situation, merely smiled and said, "The good Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing families together." Standing beside Hayes as they exchanged vows, Beatrice felt a sense of rightness that transcended the whirlwind nature of their courtship. This man, who had arrived at her door during a storm, had seen in her and the children not a makeshift family to be pitied, but a blessing to be cherished. After the ceremony, as their small group shared a wedding feast prepared by Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Miller, Beatrice found herself drawn into conversation with Mrs. Miller, a motherly woman with graying hair and kind eyes. "Hayes tells me you raised your sister's children after she passed," Mrs. Miller said. "That takes a special kind of strength." Beatrice nodded, waiting for the familiar judgment to follow, but Mrs. Miller surprised her. "My Thomas and I couldn't have children of our own," she continued. "Took in 3 orphans from the church home in Billings. Best decision we ever made." She squeezed Beatrice's hand warmly. "Blood doesn't make a family, dear. Love does. And you clearly have love in abundance." Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes. After years of whispers and sideways glances, to be understood and accepted so readily was overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. Later that night, after their guests had departed and the children were asleep, Beatrice stood on the porch of their new home, gazing up at the Montana stars. Hayes joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy, Mrs. Russell?" he murmured against her ear. "Very," she assured him, leaning back into his embrace. "Though it still seems like a dream sometimes. If it is, I hope we never wake up." Hayes turned her in his arms, his expression suddenly serious. "I want you to know something, Beatrice. I meant what I said that day on your porch in Texas. The children are a blessing. You're a blessing. The fact that you couldn't bear children of your own doesn't make you any less of a mother. In fact, it makes you more of one in my eyes, because you chose motherhood even when it wasn't easy." Beatrice reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "How did I get so lucky?" "I ask myself the same question every day. Hayes replied with a smile. Now, Mrs. Russell, I believe we have some wedding night traditions to attend to. The following spring brought new life to the Russell Ranch. Hayes's careful management had resulted in a small but healthy herd of cattle. The kitchen garden Beatrice had planted thrived in the rich Montana soil. Samuel, now 11, was learning ranching skills alongside Hayes. Margaret had made friends with both the Miller girls and had started a wildflower pressing project that threatened to take over the dining table. And James, at 5, had blossomed from a shy, uncertain child into a confident boy who followed Hayes like a shadow whenever possible. But the most significant new beginning came on a warm May morning when Beatrice awoke feeling strangely ill. After 3 mornings of the same nausea, a suspicion began to form, one so unexpected that she hardly dared voice it, even to herself. When Mrs. Johnson came to visit the following week, Beatrice hesitantly described her symptoms. The older woman's eyes lit up with understanding. "How long has it been since your monthly time?" she asked gently. Beatrice calculated quickly. "Almost 2 months. But that's happened before, especially during times of stress or change." Mrs. Johnson patted her hand. "Those other symptoms, coupled with the missed time, I'd say you're expecting, dear." The words struck Beatrice like a physical blow. "That's not possible," she whispered. "I couldn't. With Robert, we tried for years." "The human body is a mysterious thing," Mrs. Johnson said wisely. "Sometimes a change of place, a change of circumstance, can make all the difference. And sometimes," she smiled, "sometimes it's just God's timing." That evening, after the children were in bed, Beatrice told Hayes her suspicions. He listened with growing wonder, his hand moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said softly, as if testing the word. "Our baby." "If Mrs. Johnson is right," Beatrice cautioned, still afraid to fully believe. "She raised 6 children and has 11 grandchildren. I reckon she knows the signs." Hayes's face split into a radiant smile. "Oh, Beatrice, another blessing to add to our family." As her pregnancy progressed, confirmed by the traveling doctor who visited the area in July, Beatrice found herself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. From a barren widow mocked in Texas to an expectant mother cherished in Montana, the transformation seemed almost too miraculous to comprehend. The children's reactions to the news of their coming sibling varied. Samuel, practical as always, immediately began building a cradle under Hayes's guidance. Margaret alternated between excitement and jealousy, needing extra reassurance that the baby wouldn't replace her in Beatrice's affections. James, still young enough to be confused by the concept, simply accepted that Mama has a baby in her tummy with the matter-of-fact adaptability of childhood. On a crisp November evening, just as the first snow of winter began to fall, Beatrice went into labor. Hayes sent Samuel riding to fetch Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Miller, both experienced in midwifery, while he settled Margaret and James with the Miller family for the night. The birth was long and difficult. Beatrice, at 33, was older than most first-time mothers, and her body struggled with the unfamiliar process. Through the pain, she clung to Hayes's hand, drawing strength from his steady presence and unwavering faith in her. "You can do this," he murmured again and again, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest woman I know, Beatrice Russell. Just a little more." As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Beatrice gave birth to a daughter small but healthy, with a shock of dark hair like her father's, and eyes that would eventually reveal themselves to be Beatrice's warm brown. "She's perfect," Hayes whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he held his daughter for the first time. "Just like her mother." They named her Hope Caroline Russell Hope for the new beginning she represented, and Caroline in memory of Beatrice's sister, whose children had become their own. When Samuel, Margaret, and James were brought home to meet their new sister, Beatrice watched their faces carefully, searching for any sign of jealousy or resentment, but she needn't have worried. Samuel approached the cradle with solemn wonder, gently touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. Margaret immediately declared herself the baby's protector and began planning all the things she would teach her when she's bigger. And James, after a moment's consideration, simply climbed onto the bed beside Beatrice and announced, "She's our baby, right, Mama?" "That's right, darling," Beatrice confirmed, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "She's ours, just like you are." That night, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle and the older children tucked into their beds, Beatrice and Hayes sat before the fireplace, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "Did I ever tell you," Hayes said softly, "about the first time I saw you? Standing in your doorway with that shotgun. 3 children peeping around your skirts demanding to know my business?" Beatrice smiled at the memory. "I was terrified, trying to look brave. You succeeded. But what struck me most wasn't your bravery." Hayes's voice grew thoughtful. "It was how those children looked at you with complete trust and love. I knew then that I was looking at a true mother, regardless of how those children came to you." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "The folks in that Texas town were fools, Beatrice Russell. Calling you Barren when you had more maternal love in your little finger than most have in their entire being. You were never barren, you were always blessed. And now, you've blessed me with not 1 but 4 incredible children and a love I never thought I'd find again." Beatrice turned her face up to his, eyes shining with tears of happiness. "And you called me blessed when others called me barren. For that alone, I would love you forever." "Then it's a good thing you have other reasons too," Hayes teased gently, before lowering his lips to hers in a tender kiss that held all the promise of their shared future. Outside, snow continued to fall softly on their Montana home, blanketing the land in pristine white, a clean page upon which their family would write many more chapters in the years to come. But for now, in this perfect moment of peace and completion, Beatrice Russell, once mocked as barren, knew herself to be truly, abundantly blessed.